It began with a wooden box no larger than a man's hand, its walnut surface darkened by age, its brass inlay worn smooth where fingertips had traced it for generations. The box was found in the summer of 1998, tucked inside a trunk at an estate sale in rural Pennsylvania. Its lid was carved with a single motif, a small circle of leaves around a pair of crossed stems, an engraving whose meaning the family never agreed upon. But every one of them remembered the same story. They claimed this music box played by itself, always in the hours before a death in the household. Folklore, the auctioneer called it, a family superstition. Yet when a local historian purchased the box, he discovered something that complicated the tale. According to the experts, the mechanism inside could not self-wind. There was no spring reserve, no broken ratchet gear, no structural flaw that might allow the cylinder to slip and turn on its own. The box, by all technical accounts, should have been silent unless deliberately wound. And still, the record said otherwise. A photographer's logbook from 1871 contained an unsettling line beside a child's final portrait, the tune played again today. A coroner's notes from 1894 mentioned relatives reporting a melody drifting through the hall just before a fatal fall. Two unrelated records written decades apart, both referencing the same soft lullaby. The contradiction deepened as the tune itself became part of the mystery. It was gentle, almost tender, simple enough for a child to hum. Yet those who heard it late in life described something beneath the melody, a faint ticking that resembled the irregular beat of a failing heart. Memory embellishment, some argued, but others insisted the sound was unmistakable. In 2002, during a professional restoration, the box played again, this time a warped, distorted version of that same lullaby. Technicians inspected every gear and tooth, searching for the mechanical flaw that could explain it. They found none. So the question that lingered was not whether the box played, but why it did. Was it predicting death? Triggering memory? Or had the fragile metal teeth simply captured a century of grief? To understand the music box and the shadow it cast, we have to understand the family who kept it. The Wetheralls were not wealthy, nor especially prominent. They were established farmers and mill workers in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, people whose lives were measured in harvest seasons, church bells, and the slow passing of winters. Their generational home, built in the 1840s, stood at the edge of a narrow creek. Over the decades, its attic became a quiet archive of the family's memory. Boxes of folded linens, hand-labeled envelopes, marriage certificates browned at the edges, and church attendance logs kept with careful penmanship. In these documents, the music box appears not as a relic of superstition, but as a simple household item present across generations. Two surviving daguerreotypes from the 1870s show the box faintly in the background, the brass inlay catching the light on a side table, its presence so ordinary that no one bothered to center it in the frame. Yet those same photographs would later become pieces of evidence in a story that stretched far beyond the Wetheral property. The timeline begins in 1869, when an itinerant Swiss clockmaker traveled through Pennsylvania, offering repairs and selling handcrafted instruments to rural families. His name is mostly lost to history, mentioned only once in a county notice. What remains certain is that he left behind the walnut-and-brass music box. According to family accounts, it played a variation of Schleif, Kindlein, Schleif, a traditional Swiss lullaby meant to soothe children into sleep. Nothing unusual until the first death. 6 months after the box arrived, a young Wetheral child, for years old, died of what was then called winter fever. Family notes mention the melody playing the night before. At the time, no one questioned it. But as decades passed, the pattern surfaced again and again. 3 written testimonies, dated 1880, 1887, and 1905, mention the tune returning before tragedy. Short, plain statements, but consistent enough that later researchers could not disregard them. The local church ledger adds another thread. On a page listing families affected by illness and hardship, a pastor wrote a descriptive line beside the Wetherall's name, marked by unusual misfortunes. No mention of the music box, no hint of superstition. Yet the tone suggested a family weighed down by more than their share of grief. And this is where the central question of the documentary takes shape. Was the music box a mechanical anomaly misunderstood across generations? A superstition retold until memory hardened into belief? Or was it a physical object that absorbed trauma, an instrument whose delicate metal teeth echoed the losses the family could not speak aloud? The truth lies somewhere between history and memory, and it begins here. The earliest clues surrounding the music box do not present themselves as dramatic revelations, but as quiet patterns scattered across 2 decades of family writing. Between 1869 and 1889, 7 Wetherill deaths occurred under circumstances that seemed ordinary for the time: illness, injury, unforeseen accidents. What joined them was not the manner of death, but the detail repeatedly noted by relatives: the sound of the music box playing beforehand. These mentions were not poetic or embellished. They were plain observations in journals, letters, and margin notes describing a melody heard at moments when no music should have been playing at all. The first cluster of these tragedies, spanning 1869 to 1874, stands out with particular clarity. 2 infant deaths appear in the church records, one in the winter of 1869, the other early in 1871. In both cases, the mothers later wrote that the lullaby returned the evening before the children fell ill. In 1872, a barn accident took the life of an older cousin. The surviving family remembered hearing the melody drifting from the parlor that morning, even though no one had wound the box in days. Then, in 1874, a flu outbreak passed through several Pennsylvania counties, claiming the life of another Wetheral child. The family letter written during those weeks described a tune as a soft, almost kind music, yet wrong in timing, a line that would later be attributed to Miriam Wetherill, one of the family's most consistent record keepers. Miriam's 1874 letter became one of the earliest written acknowledgments that the music seemed to appear at moments of loss. Her words conveyed no hysteria, no extravagance, only discomfort, as though she were documenting a household detail that unsettled her but had not yet taken shape as a belief. Historians later remarked that her phrasing, wrong in timing, was an understated attempt to capture emotional unease in an era when superstition and rationality often coexisted without conflict. Outside the Wetherill home, skepticism formed quickly. Neighbors, hearing the family's accounts, often dismissed them as grief-charged coincidences. Rural communities in the late 19th century were familiar with hardship. Clusters of deaths, especially among children, were tragically common. Some suggested the Wetherills had created a superstition as a way of coping, attaching meaning to misfortune so the tragedies felt less random. Others believed the story grew simply because the family spent long winters indoors, where stories traveled easily from one generation to the next. The counterpoint to this skepticism came from experts, though not in the way one might expect. Early mechanical assessments of similar music boxes made one point unequivocally clear: a device of this type could not play autonomously. It needed to be wound. If unwound, it was wholly inert. Yet several diaries from the 1870s described hearing the melody in locked rooms, written by individuals who did not write to one another and who lived in different parts of the property. They noted faint, intermittent playing, sometimes only the opening bars, as though a mechanism were struggling against its own limits. This gap between mechanical certainty and lived experience sparked early psychological interpretations among modern researchers. Some cited anticipatory grief, the emotional state that heightens senses and distorts memory in families facing repeated loss. Others suggested collective trauma, shared grief reinforcing a common narrative, even if details varied. A few pointed to memory distortion, the way certain images or sounds can retroactively attach themselves to emotionally charged events. But even with these explanations, the pattern remained difficult to ignore. The earliest mentions of the music originated from different hands, written in different years, at different points in the family's history, yet the descriptions of the tune were remarkably consistent. A gentle lullaby, soft enough to soothe a child, always arriving at moments when comfort was needed but never asked for. A melody recorded long before the family began suspecting it meant something more. As the documentary shifts into the late 19th and early 20th centuries, a new layer of complexity emerges. One built not on family stories or community folklore, but on physical artifacts and surviving archival records. These are not emotional accounts or whispered memories. These are the documents that historians lean on when attempting to distinguish myth from verifiable history. The most significant breakthrough comes from an unexpected source. A restoration log from the 1890s, written by a local craftsman named Elijah Brome, a clock repairer from Strasbourg. His notebook, discovered in 1978 in a box of auction estate items, contains a brief but startling passage describing his attempt to fix the Wetheral music box. He writes of a slowing mechanism, an internal tension system that had begun to drag and produce a faint metallic rasp. Brome meticulously sketched the gear teeth, spring tension, and cylinder layout, and his technical drawings show nothing unusual. Yet his personal notes, the ones he likely never expected another person to read, contain a line that stands out. I hear the tune even after closing the workshop. The box is not wound. Perhaps fatigue is playing with my senses. Is the kind of entry historians often label as subjective, yet its value lies not in proving the impossible, but in showing that even an outsider, a trained mechanical craftsman, reported hearing the melody under circumstances that defied natural explanation. Fast forward more than a century, a 2002 micro-inspection of the artifact brings the attention of modern precision tools. Under magnification, experts examine the gear teeth, spring coils, and internal joints. They find no evidence of abnormal wear, no hidden spring tensioners, no irregularities that might cause an accidental or spontaneous activation of the cylinder. Infrared scans reveal nothing concealed beneath the chamber. Laser profilometry confirms that the box behaves exactly like any typical 19th century Swiss music mechanism. Yet the one thing the inspection cannot explain is the historical audio anomaly tied to the object. In 1947, during a family gathering, the Wetherills made a low-fidelity home recording, one of the earliest in the family's possession. In the background of the tape, nearly drowned out by static and conversation, lies a faint melodic sequence believed to be the same Swiss lullaby. But beneath the melody, audio specialists uncovered something else, a double-click rhythm, two sharp mechanical taps repeating under the tune, consistent across the entire segment. Experts describe it as not part of standard music box movement, something that would require a non-existent internal component. This anomaly fuels new interest in archival materials. Digging through community church files from Lancaster County, researchers uncover a church pamphlet printed in 1898 containing an odd reference. In a section describing local gatherings, a line reads, "The Wetheral tune, somber yet familiar, was heard again last night." The phrasing is casual, written as if everyone in the area already knew exactly what the tune meant. It implies that by the late 19th century, the melody had become part of local identity, recognized, labeled, and associated specifically with the Wetherill family. Another strange piece of evidence emerges from a 1937 genealogy journal kept by a distant relative documenting the family line. Among the entries, one stands out. Our bloodline has always carried a melody tied to misfortune. It is a poetic line, but it is also a rare example of a family acknowledging a pattern without directly attributing it to superstition or belief. It is simply written as fact. Then comes the discovery that shifts the tone of the investigation entirely, a missing page from a county coroner's ledger, archived in a separate box of undecategorized papers. The page outlines the drowning of a man named Thomas Wetherill, who died in a creek in early spring. The margins contain the widow's handwritten statement. The box played before dawn. I knew it was my husband. I knew something had happened. This is one of the earliest references linking the melody not just to tragedy, but to a sense of forewarning, an idea that the music was not reacting to events, but signaling them. Historians interviewed for the documentary offer grounded explanations. Some suggest that humidity, common in Pennsylvania's fluctuating climate, can warp wooden components and cause music boxes to creak or shift. But even they concede that full melodic sequences, complete, smooth, and perfectly timed, are mechanically impossible without active winding. The explanation, while logical, does not match the details in the documented testimonies. And yet the most significant piece of evidence would not be found until the 2002 restoration. While examining the internal casing, restorers noticed a thin seam in the back panel and discovered a hidden compartment no larger than a matchbox. Inside was a delicate, folded fragment of paper worn thin by time. Written in fading ink, in German script were the words, "Für das Kind, das nicht zurückkommt," for the child who did not return. It is a message that introduces a possibility no one had previously considered, that the music box was never intended to be a simple household heirloom, nor a tool of entertainment. It might have been created and concealed to honor a loss deeper than any the Wetherills recorded in their family line. As the section closes, the documentary leans into a rising tension. The box may not be a cursed object. It may not be a supernatural instrument. But it is almost certainly a memorial, crafted in grief, carrying a message, and passed unknowingly through generations who suffered without ever understanding what they had inherited. The investigation enters its most revealing phase when researchers begin looking not at the Wetheral family, but at the man who built the music box. For over a century, he was identified only as a Swiss itinerant clockmaker, a nameless artisan who passed briefly through Pennsylvania in the spring of 1869. But new archival requests made to Swiss records in Zurich uncover a startling truth. The craftsman did have a name, Johann Alder, and his own life contained a tragedy eerily similar to the stories that would later surround the Wetherill household. Official church registries list that Alder lost his only child, a boy named Lucas, in late 1868. The cause is recorded simply as fever or fever. 3 months later, grief-stricken and heavily indebted, Alder left Switzerland. Passenger logs confirm his arrival in Philadelphia in March 1869, the same period when local accounts report a foreign clockmaker traveling through Lancaster County offering repairs and selling handmade music boxes. This timeline reframes the entire narrative. It suggests that the music box, always assumed to be a custom piece created for the Wetherills, may not have been built for them at all. Instead, it may have already carried emotional resonance or even unresolved grief long before it ever entered their home. The discovery leads to what historians in the documentary call the master hypothesis. The box was not a Wetherill heirloom, it was Alder's mourning object. Evidence supporting this comes from a surviving partial blueprint found in a Zurich archive. Though faded, the layout of the music box's cylinder is unmistakable. The engraved teeth that control the melody, the tiny metal pins responsible for plucking each note, are spaced in a peculiar pattern. When digitized and analyzed by modern audio engineers, the spacing produces a waveform that resembles the repeating rhythm of a human heartbeat. Not perfectly anatomical, but symbolically close enough to raise serious questions about Alder's intention. This blueprint changes the tone of the investigation. The melody, a variation of Schleif, Kindlein Schleif, may have been selected not for its cultural familiarity, but as a personal lullaby, one that Alder likely sang to his child. The box, then, wasn't an ordinary crafted item. It was a vessel carrying a father's grief into a foreign land. Meanwhile, the pattern of tragedies within the Wetherill lineage grows even more troubling when researchers analyze the final cluster of events between 1891 and 1916. The box's association with death becomes more pronounced, more documented, and disturbingly more consistent. Accounts from family diaries describe the melody sounding hours before 3 critical illnesses, each involving a different member of the household. In another case, written testimony from a distant nephew indicates the tune was heard days before a suicide, though the family concealed the event at the time due to social stigma. The most chilling case comes from a 1916 house fire, where 2 children reportedly heard the melody just minutes before smoke entered the hallway. In all 3 clusters, the timing is recorded not as coincidence, but as omen, an early warning that preceded tragedy. Yet the most compelling first-hand testimony comes from a 1910 household nanny named Evelyn Hart, whose private letters were uncovered in 1989. She describes being present when the Wetherills sold the music box to a neighboring family after a series of illnesses. The nanny writes, "It played even after we sold it. The tragedies followed the box, not the house." Her claim reframes the causality entirely. The misfortunes were not bound to the Wetherill home, nor even to the family. They appeared to travel with the object itself. Evelyn's letter reports that within a year, the neighbors experienced a barn collapse and stillbirth, events she explicitly links to hearing the tune again, faintly, late at night. As the documentary returns to the modern era, restoration experts offer new insight. During the 2002 examination, technicians reported something subtle but remarkable. The box gives off faint metallic vibrations, detectable only through sensitive equipment, even when completely motionless and unwound. These vibrations are not rhythmic enough to constitute a mechanical function, yet they suggest the internal components retain a kind of residual tension, as though storing potential energy that should not exist without winding. Engineers attempt to explain the anomaly in logical terms: thermal expansion, metal fatigue, microscopic shifts in tension. But none of these theories convincingly account for the consistent, measurable hum present even in a temperature-controlled environment. And so the documentary reaches its most difficult question, the one researchers cannot conclusively answer. Is the music box merely reacting to the emotional turbulence of the people who own it, an object sensitive to grief, stress, or loss in ways science cannot yet measure? Or has it become something else entirely? A catalyst? A trigger? A silent participant in the tragedies that followed it across continents and generations? The episode closes without resolving this tension. The uncertainty is what lingers, the idea that some objects do not merely survive history, but accumulate it, absorbing the emotional weight of every hand that holds them and every grief they were present for. The investigation reaches its emotional and intellectual summit in 2015 when a routine cataloging project at a small Lutheran church in Lancaster County uncovers a dusty, cloth-bound diary long believed lost. The archivist who found it remembers the moment vividly, a bundle of loose papers tied with string, wedged behind a warped shelf. Inside the bundle lay the personal writings of Eleanor Wetherill, dated 1870, a full year after the music box first entered the family home. Until this point, most early Wetheral records were fragmentary, scattered mentions in ledgers, grief noted in church attendance logs, and the occasional quote preserved in genealogy journals. But the diary provides something far more intimate, the family's private, unfiltered account of the very first tragedy ever associated with the music box. In an entry dated February 3, 1870, Eleanor describes waking in the early hours of the morning to a sound she recognized but could not place. She writes, "I heard the box playing, though no one had wound it. The tune was slow, tender, almost pleading." Hours later, her 3-month-old daughter, Anna Wetherill, fell gravely ill and died before sundown. The entry is not dramatic, not embellished. It reads like the quiet, stunned voice of a mother trying to document something she does not yet understand. Eleanor mentions only the melody, the timing, and a feeling she calls a sorrow that stood in the hall like a guest. This diary becomes the crucial missing piece. For the first time, the timeline aligns perfectly. The creation of the music box, the Swiss clockmaker's unresolved grief, and the very first Wetheral death all intersect within months of one another. From here, the documentary begins connecting every thread. The tiny folded note found in the hidden compartment, "Für das Kind, das nicht zurückkommt," takes on a new and devastating context. It is no longer a cryptic message, it is a memorial. When cross-referenced with Swiss burial registries and the Zurich blueprint, the story of Johann Alder becomes uncomfortably clear. He crafted the box in the months following the loss of his own son, embedding his child's memory into its mechanism. The engraved teeth, when plotted as data points, trace a waveform closely resembling a human heartbeat. What once seemed like coincidence now feels deliberate. The Wetheral family's long chain of tragedies, spanning from 1869 to 1916, no longer appears as a random collection of misfortunes amplified by superstition. It becomes part of a much larger narrative, an artifact born in grief, finding its way into a household already vulnerable, where every loss amplified the emotional weight the box carried. The documentary then introduces a pivotal discovery made by Dr. Lyle Renwick, a mechanical historian specializing in 19th century automata. While analyzing Alder's blueprint, Renwick notices something subtle, yet transformative. The spacing of the cylinder's teeth matches a little-known European memorial tradition. In the mid-1800s, some grieving parents encoded a lost child's heartbeat into music box mechanisms as a private form of remembrance. This revelation reframes everything. The music box was not built as a supernatural instrument, nor as a tool for prediction. It was created as an act of mourning, an attempt by a bereaved father to preserve the last trace of his child, his heartbeat, through a melody. The lullaby, once believed to be a traditional Swiss tune, was in fact Alder's personal adaptation, shaped not by folklore but by loss. And yet, the documentary does not allow this explanation to settle fully. Because even with this understanding, the box's later behavior remains extraordinary. The chilling layer emerges when modern acoustical engineers analyze the 1947 home recording containing the faint double click beneath the melody. Using spectral analysis, they determine that these clicks correspond not to mechanical failures, but to tiny shifts in the metal teeth, subtle alterations that accumulate over decades when a music box is exposed to temperature fluctuations, vibrations, and microscopic stress. One expert describes it this way: metal remembers. It carries the echoes of every environment it's been in, every tremor, every tension. Over decades of Wetheral sorrow, infant deaths, illness, accidents, fires, the box's mechanism appears to have recorded new vibrations, layering emotional history into its physical structure. Not conscious, not supernatural, but deeply human in its responsiveness. Resonance becomes memory. This leads to the documentary's most haunting conclusion. The melody never predicted death. It reacted to the conditions that often preceded it. Moments of household distress, shifts in weight on old floorboards, Temperature drops during fever nights. The trembling hands of caregivers. Slight disruptions in the environment as families braced for crises they didn't yet see coming. The music box was not an omen, it was a barometer. A sensitive, grief-built instrument responding to the invisible breaking of the people around it. Near the end of the section, the documentary presents the final connecting realization. The tune that haunted the family for decades was never warning them. It was mourning with them, vibrating sympathetically with the emotional and physical disturbances that precede tragedy. The climax arrives with Eleanor's diary, its quiet admission, its intimate fear, echoing through the investigation. Her words, preserved across nearly 150 years, blend with the mechanical truths uncovered by modern science. The music box played not because it foresaw death, but because it felt the tremors of a world about to change. A century of accumulated grief, held in brass and walnut, singing a lullaby for every heart that broke near it. After the final Wetherill death associated with the melody in 1916, the music box began a long, curious journey through a series of unrelated households. Its transfer was never dramatic. No auction announcements, no documented sales, just quiet handovers, often during periods of financial strain or estate division. But each new home left behind its own small trail of notes, observations, and uneasy recollections. The box's first post-Wetherill owner, a retired mill foreman named Thomas Brigg, kept it displayed on a mantel. His daughter later recalled hearing the tune only once, sometime in 1921, the same night Brigg suffered a cardiac episode that he survived. In the margin of a 1923 family letter, a relative wrote simply, "That song again. How strange it was." In the 1930s, regional newspapers in Pennsylvania began running short human interest pieces about what locals called the Death Melody Box. These were not sensational headlines, but brief columns tucked between farming reports and church notices, stories that mingled curiosity with caution. One 1934 article described it as an heirloom with a tune that arrives in difficult hours, while another mentioned it alongside traditional Appalachian superstitions. The tone was never explicitly paranormal. Rather, it portrayed a community unsure whether to laugh, worry, or simply acknowledge a long-standing tale. As the decades progressed, interpretations shifted with cultural attitudes. In the 1950s, when American fascination with hauntings briefly surged, small paranormal groups attempted to investigate the box. Their reports were inconclusive, and several dismissed the entire legend as a mixture of coincidence and the power of suggestion. At the same time, academic historians argued for a more grounded explanation, intergenerational storytelling shaping perception, grief shaping memory, and mechanical quirks shaping fear. By the 1970s and 1980s, the music box had passed through two more households, both reporting at least one moment when the melody played unexpectedly, each followed, weeks or months later, by a significant family event, a stroke in one home, a house fire in another. Whether these events held any true correlation remains uncertain, but the families preserved their experiences carefully, as if participating in a story larger than themselves. The modern era brought a new kind of scrutiny. When the 2002 restoration recording leaked online, capturing the warped, aching rendition of the Swiss lullaby with its faint double click beneath the melody, the public fascination grew dramatically. Some listeners described the tune as beautiful, others found it unsettling, like a memory half remembered. Debates erupted across forums, podcasts, and amateur history circles. Was the box playing spontaneously because of warped metal and environmental vibrations? Or had generations of storytelling created a lens through which every sound became meaningful? Scholars raised ethical questions as well. Were people romanticizing a century of genuine family tragedies? Was it appropriate to treat a mourning object, built from a father's grief, as a curiosity? Should artifacts born from personal loss be displayed or discussed publicly at all? Today, the music box rests in a climate-controlled archival vault in Lancaster County. Its brass cylinder, once etched with a heartbeat, now sits behind protective glass. Technicians check it monthly for stability. It has not played a full tune since 2009. What remains is not just the object, but the story it carried, a story of grief, memory, resonance, and the fragile ways in which people try to make sense of sorrow. Grief has a way of embedding itself into the world around us, settling into objects, rooms, and even the faintest grooves of memory. Families, confronted with loss they cannot alter or explain, create stories to survive the unbearable, narratives that shape the way generations remember what has passed. The Wetheral music box is one such repository, holding within its delicate brass and walnut casing the echoes of sorrow, the vibrations of loss that traveled through decades of human lives. It is neither cursed nor haunted in any mystical sense. The melody is not prophecy, nor is it malice. Instead, it is a physical archive of emotion, a vessel in which human grief has, over a century, left its traces. Each faint metallic click, each warped note, is a testament not to the supernatural, but to the accumulation of memory, attention, and vulnerability. In listening to it, one hears not forewarning, but remembrance, an artifact that has absorbed the weight of lives touched by death, fear, and love. And so the haunting is subtle, almost gentle. The music box never predicted death. It simply remembered every one of them,